Garrett Marchbanks is 190 pounds, 6 foot 2 inches tall. They call him the man-child for a good reason. They had to lower the foot pegs. He's got a taller seat, a lot of modifications done to the ClubMX YZ250F to make it fit the guy like Garrett Marchbanks. He's also got air forks on it, so a lot of cool things about this bike. Let's dive into it. The ClubMX Yamaha team has been around since 2018, but this team really begun to gain traction in the past 2 years. In 2020, Josh Hill came out of retirement to race again aboard a ClubMX Yamaha YZ250F, and that brought a lot of extra attention to the team. Then, last year, in 2021, ClubMX signed former Pro Circuit Kawasaki rider Garrett Marchbanks, who was also a former 250 class race winner at the 2020 Daytona Supercross. Garrett Marchbanks had already lots of experience at the ClubMX training facility, living and training there during his amateur years, so it was a natural fit for him to move back to the facility and join the race team when he was left without a factory ride for the 2021 season. At 6 foot 2 inches tall, 190 pounds, the 20-year-old stature truly lives up to his nickname, the man-child. Garrett scored a 3rd place finish at Orlando #2 on his privateer Yamaha 250 last season, and he scored 4 more top 5 finishes in Supercross in 2021. In outdoors last year, Garrett was competitive, scoring 5th overall at High Point, with his best moto finish being a 4th place. And so far in 2022, at the recording of this video, he has scored multiple 4th place finishes in the 250 West Division and even made a debut in the 450 class at Daytona. Motocross Action loves testing bikes of the top riders, and for this test, we flew all the way out to South Carolina and spent a week at the ClubMX training facility riding on multiple tracks. We got to test Garrett's bike 1 month before Anaheim 1. Diving into the bike and team, Brandon Haas started the ClubMX Yamaha team to help out riders that he felt deserved a factory ride, and his team has continued to grow each year since he started it. One of Brandon's main goals with this team is to show others that privateers can be competitive against the factory teams, and yes, every part on the ClubMX Yamaha is available to the public. Starting with the engine, ClubMX uses Twisted Development, and together with Jamie Ellis over there, they came up with a ClubMX spec YZ250F engine, and Twisted Development is actually able to sell this package to any YZ250F customer willing to buy it. ClubMX isn't like the factory teams that builds its own engines in-house. They let Twisted Development handle all of the modifications on their bikes, but instead of shipping the engines all the way back to California for every refresh, ClubMX handles all of the rebuilds and maintenance on their engines right from their training facility in South Carolina. So getting into the engine details, Twisted Development uses a 2020 head with their own CNC work on their YZ250F engines. The valve seats and webcams are modified, and they use crankwork rods. The transmissions have been heat treated, but the gears are left stock. As for the YZ250F head, it was updated in 2021, but Twisted Development felt that they could make the 2020 head work better because with the smaller intake port, there's more material for Jamie to shape with and improve airflow in this engine. I was also surprised that they didn't adjust the transmission to make it harder to get into neutral, but Brandon explained to me that they haven't had issues with the bikes going into false neutral on the Supercross track, and they prefer to keep the transmission stock so that the bikes can get into neutral easier, because the electric starting on Yamahas can be tricky, and it's a lot easier to start it when it's in neutral. The ClubMX spec YZ250F uses VP Pro 6 fuel with a 2nd fuel injector mounted in the intake. Twisted Development makes this fuel injector, and to maximize power on the bottom end that Yamaha is already known for, ClubMX uses the DT1 air filter's YZ250F intake system with the loudmouth air filter to open up the airbox. They also use a larger carbon fiber vented airbox cover from P3 Carbon, and they also drill holes in the back of the airbox as well. Finishing things off, ClubMX uses the full FMF factory RCT 4.1 titanium exhaust system with added FMF muffler guards to complement the engine. As for maintenance, the team rebuilds engines on their race bikes every weekend out of a precaution, but because they use the same engine spec for practice and racing, they know that they can get 10 to 15 hours out of a top end and 25 to 30 hours out of a bottom end with this spec engine, because that's what they run on their practice bikes. The theory behind the ClubMX engines is to produce as much power as possible and then use the ECU, the Vortex ignition, to tune that power to each rider's liking. Garrett Marchbanks likes to have a little more engine braking in Supercross because it helps him push through the rhythm sections while keeping his front end down in the air. For outdoors, Garrett actually likes less engine braking, giving the engine more freedom to roll. Gearing, Garrett prefers the long pull of the 14-tooth countershaft sprocket with a 51-tooth rear in Supercross and a 50-tooth in outdoors. Not only is Garrett Marchbanks 190 pounds on the scales, but he's also 6'2". So to help him fit on the YZ250F, ClubMX uses Guts Racing's Phantom lightweight seat foam that is 25 millimeters taller than stock, and they use 7 millimeter taller Luxon handlebar risers with the MC Bend Mica metal handlebars. They also use lowered Flow Motorsports foot pegs that conveniently mount into the stock position, but have a platform that is 10 millimeters down and 12 millimeters further backwards to help the man-child evenly distribute his weight on the bike. Amazingly, ClubMX dropped 9 pounds off of the 2022 YZ250F, which brings it into the 218 pound range, which for reference is about stock on the KTM 250 SXF for 2022. ClubMX Yamaha lost about 1 pound using the KYB air forks. Another pound was dropped using Luxon triple clamps at the stock 22 millimeter offset, and the Luxon handlebar mounts lost a lot of weight as well. So Luxon is working on a new link arm for the ClubMX, the stock length just a little bit lighter, 3/4 of a pound lighter actually, so that's going to help limit some weight as well. That wasn't on the bike when we rode it, but this team is doing everything they can to limit weight. They also went all out using titanium for every bolt, every mount, and every axle possible, and they also use Featherlight fire-powered batteries to drop weight, as well as lighter spokes and lighter hubs. Sadly, we actually didn't get any close-up video shots of the bike with titanium bolts for this video. Garrett Marchbanks was busy training on his one bike that he has with all the trick titanium bolts, axles, swing arm pivot nuts, and so forth, while we took photos and rode on his spare bike. So his spare bike actually had everything the same. It had the same engine, suspension, handlebars, foot peg, seat, and everything else, and the only difference was that it was about 6 pounds heavier because it was missing all of that titanium. However, after we were all done shooting photos and we were done riding and shooting videos on Garrett's bike, we did get to ride his full titanium bike, and that was a lot of fun. It gave us really the full experience of what it's like to ride Garrett Marchbanks' bike. So it wasn't too different. It was definitely lighter to take off the stand and a little bit lighter in the air on the track, but it wasn't so different that it was night and day for us. Both bikes were extremely fast and both bikes were extremely stiff suspension-wise, and that's where we'll dive into suspension. ClubMX uses Enzo suspension, but it's built by Craig Decker in Texas. So if you haven't heard of Craig, he has experience developing almost all of James Stewart's Kawasaki's and almost all of Ricky Carmichael's Hondas. He did turnkey bike development for those guys, working on a lot more than just suspension. So when Craig comes to test at the ClubMX facility, he gets the job done quickly. And surprisingly, Garrett is actually using the KYB air forks that I mentioned earlier on this video. These are the same forks that Yamaha stepped away from on their production bike years ago, but they're the same forks that Star Racing Yamaha is actually running on multiple 250 and 450 riders to get comfort and to lessen weight on the track. In Garrett Marchbanks' KYB shock, there's a check valve that gives the rear end a dead feeling on the holdup of the shock. So when the valve engages, it actually manipulates the oil passage. So when you push down on the shock, it has a dead Supercross feeling, but the shock still moves. So most riders use the check valve in Supercross, but not outdoors. While the traditional shock might wallow, the check valve shock stays settled longer in corners. It can be really abusive on the rider to use the check valve in the shock, but Garrett Marchbanks doesn't mind this for Supercross or outdoors because he's so big and he rides the bike with his legs a lot more than most riders. So how rough is Garrett Marchbanks on his equipment? I asked the ClubMX guys, and I was surprised to hear that he isn't a clutch abuser, but he actually cracks his radiators because he squeezes his legs so hard on this 250 that they have to replace them every couple weeks of practice. ClubMX, for the wheels, they also have their own spec from Rims Plus with the hubs that were milled out and also with custom spokes that are lighter and stronger. They actually run a Honda front wheel because the pattern has less spokes, which makes the wheel lighter, and ClubMX uses DID LTX rims because the riders on the ClubMX team prefer the softer feel that they have, plus a little bit of weight savings as well. The Pirelli tires that they were running are also lighter than Dunlop's, and Garrett really likes the mid to soft compound almost anywhere. And then for outdoors, he loves the scoop tire. The ClubMX guys explained that they have to beg him to take the scoop tire off, even when it's on hard packed and tacky track. As for the brakes, Garrett has stock brake calipers and pads with Flow brake rotors and GYTR steel braided brake lines. They also use an older generation Honda front brake master cylinder that is very popular in the pro pits, and the stock brake calipers were also Cerakoted for looks and strength as well. The other aftermarket parts on this bike, in addition to the ones we've already mentioned, they use Flow Motorsports clutch perch and levers, an NGK spark plug, engine ice coolant, and a Guts seat cover. Plus, the ClubMX bike has a full Hinson clutch system with the basket, pressure plate, hub, fibers, steels, and cover. They use a Chirby's plastics, a P3 carbon skid plate, Mica metal handlebars, grips, sprockets, and chains, all from Mica metals, and they use the Tamer dual position hole shot device. All right guys, let's dive into the real fun part about this video. It is cool to learn all about what ClubMX did to this bike, but talking about how it works on the track, even more fun. So we got to experience two versions of Garrett Marchbanks' ClubMX YZ250F race bike. We rode it with Supercross suspension one day with standard bolts and then also with titanium bolts. And then we also rode it with outdoor suspension the next day. So with Supercross suspension, Garrett Marchbanks YZ250F rides like a hardtail mountain bike. Set for 190 pounds, it is so stiff that it barely compresses when you take the bike off the stand, barely compresses when you push on it, and it barely compresses even on the track. For a 175-pound test rider, you really have to go fast to make the suspension work. We were also blown away by the Twisted Development YZ250F power. It comes on strong with that signature Yamaha bottom end grunt, but this one, it never stops pulling. Even though Garrett Marchbanks is the biggest rider in the class, he keeps up with factory riders on a privateer YZ250F. He even passed RJ Hampshire going up a hill at Thunder Valley in 2021, which is at high elevation in Colorado. So comparing this engine to other factory bikes that we've ridden, this engine feels just as strong as the factory bikes, and it does not feel like a privateer bike at all. The Star Racing Yamaha YZ250F is commonly known in the pro pits for being the fastest 254 stroke on the track right now, and the ClubMX Yamaha team is doing everything in their power to stick close with them. Plus, Jamie Ellis has talked to us about the experience that he's had by developing engines for Honda, KTM, Kawasaki, and Suzuki actually help him continue to make improvements on the Yamaha YZ250 engine. So overall, this engine is extremely fast. As for suspension, there's really only one pleasant thing about his Supercross settings, and that's that they save your butt in a pickle. Stiff suspension will track better to whoops, and it protects you big time whenever you're casing or overshooting jumps. We tested Garrett Marchbanks' bike on a tamed down version of a Supercross track, and eventually we came to appreciate his Supercross suspension. The motocross setting was also stiff, but it was much more comfortable in comparison. The KYB shock with the check valve stayed planted well in the corners on the rough ClubMX training track, and the air forks worked great as well. After Supercross settings on day one, there were zero complaints with how stiff the stuff was on outdoors. It definitely worked well for our test riders. Once we got comfortable with the suspension, the bike handled well on both tracks. The Luxon triple clamps offer a precise feel on the front end, while the lowered and back flow foot pegs and the taller gut seat cover certainly open up the cockpit on the YZ250F, making this thing a lot more comfortable and a lot more planted going through rough sand sections and parts on the track where you really need to have good control of the motorcycle. Overall, no matter how fast his 250F is, Garrett Marchbanks will always search for more power. Why is that? It's been hardwired into his brain since he was a large 14-year-old on Kawasaki mini bikes, training himself to ride wide open wherever he went. Describing this ClubMX Yamaha in one sentence, Garrett Marchbanks' ClubMX Yamaha YZ250F is a rocket ship of a motorcycle with a suspension that is so stiff, only a man-child could appreciate it. That's all for our tested video on Garrett Marchbanks' YZ250F race bike from the ClubMX Muc-Off FXR team. This thing was ultra impressive and we had a blast riding this thing on the track. Hope you guys liked this. If you want to learn more about this bike, check out motocrossactionmag.com. Also, subscribe to our YouTube channel and click the notification button so you can get an update whenever we release videos on factory bikes, stock bikes, project bikes, two-strokes, and more.